For 6 years, Rachel had lived alone in the frozen woods of Maine. Her only companion, the camera she carried everywhere. But through her lens one morning, she captured something she had never seen before. A starving bobcat mother and two frail kittens struggling to survive the winter cold. And when the weakest collapsed, the mother did something unthinkable. She laid her broken child on Rachel's porch, as if asking for help. So in that fragile heartbeat, trust crossed the boundary between wild and human, and Rachel discovered that even in her deepest solitude, she had not been forgotten. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. And if this story touches your heart, like and subscribe for more true stories of love, courage, and second chances. The wind howled through the pines like a restless ocean, rattling the windows of Rachel Miller's cabin. It was late winter in Maine, that strange in-between season when the snow could linger for weeks, hard as marble, and the mornings carried both silence and menace. Rachel had grown used to the sound of wind replacing conversation, and she no longer minded. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her coffee steaming against the sharp air. In her lap rested the camera she'd carried like a second pair of eyes since her husband and daughter were killed in that car accident 6 years ago. Every morning, without fail, she raised the telephoto lens and aimed it at the woods, searching for birds. The flicker of a cardinal, the flash of a blue jay. This morning, however, the frame revealed something else. Through the icy haze, a shadow moved along the tree line. At first, Rachel thought it was a deer, maybe a stray coyote. But then the shape stepped into view, and her breath caught. A bobcat, gaunt, ribs showing beneath a dull winter coat, emerged from the snowdrifts. Not just one, but three. The mother and two frail kittens trotting close at her heels. Rachel's finger trembled on the shutter. The click of the camera echoed like a gunshot in the stillness, yet the bobcat didn't bolt. She froze, amber eyes fixed on the cabin, her stance neither panicked nor curious. It was as if she was waiting. Rachel lowered the camera, heart hammering. Never in her years of bird photography had she seen a wild bobcat this close, let alone with kittens. They weren't supposed to linger near humans, and yet here they were, framed against the pines, staring directly at her. One kitten tripped in the snow, too weak to keep up. The stronger one nudged it forward, tiny body shivering. The sight struck something deep in Rachel, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. That ache of wanting to reach out, to shield, to mother. The mother bobcat shifted her weight, her paws sinking into the powder, then let out a low, chuffing sound. Rachel recognized the tone. It wasn't a threat. It sounded more like exhaustion. The wind gusted, swirling snow across the clearing, and for a moment the cats blurred into ghosts. When the air cleared, they were gone, swallowed by the forest. But the image lingered in Rachel's camera and in her mind. She scrolled through the digital shots inside her cabin, fingers brushing the screen as if touching the creatures themselves. Each photo felt like a mirror, showing not only their hunger but also her own loneliness. That night, she couldn't sleep. The photo of the mother bobcat's stare pressed behind her eyelids like a question she couldn't answer. Why had the animal come so close? Why hadn't she fled at the sound of the shutter? Sometime near dawn, Rachel rose, restless. She poured another mug of coffee and stepped back onto the porch. The snow stretched endless and empty, but she kept watching, waiting. The woods had given her a glimpse of something raw and fragile, and she knew instinctively it wasn't the last time she would see them. She shivered, though not from the cold. The forest had opened its door, and Rachel wasn't sure if she wanted to walk through. But a small, dangerous hope had already been planted. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The following morning, Rachel awoke to the stillness that only winter in Maine could deliver. No plows on the road, no chatter of neighbors, just the creak of her cabin timbers shifting against the cold. Her solitude had become a second skin, uncomfortable at first, then familiar, then somehow impossible to remove. Years had passed since she'd spoken to anyone beyond the cashier at the Bar Harbor grocery store or the ranger who occasionally checked the trailheads. Friends had stopped calling after she turned down invitation after invitation. "I'm fine," she always told them. "Just need some time." But time had stretched into a permanent exile, and the silence of the forest became her chosen companion. She filled it with routine: coffee, camera, long walks through the pines where the snow muffled even her own footsteps. Photographing birds had been her way of reminding herself that beauty still existed, that life carried on whether she joined it or not. Yet now, every crack of the cabin's old wood reminded her of the eyes she had seen through her lens the day before. The Bobcat mother had not run. That detail gnawed at her like a splinter. Rachel found herself glancing more often at the tree line. She lingered longer on the porch, boots sinking into snowdrifts that reached her calves. She told herself it was for the birds, but her heart was waiting for something else. By the third morning, her patience was rewarded. A faint crunch of snow carried on the wind. She raised her camera just as the mother bobcat emerged once more. The kittens huddled close, their fur dusted with frost. Rachel's breath puffed out in a cloud. She pressed the shutter. Click, click, click. But her hands shook so badly that half the shots blurred. This time, the bobcat didn't simply pass through. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, body tense but steady. Her gaze locked on Rachel's porch, as if testing whether the human was threat or refuge. One kitten, the stronger one, tugged playfully at its sibling's ear before sitting back down. The frailer one stumbled, nearly collapsing, then clawed itself upright. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. For a long minute, neither woman nor wildcat moved. It was a standoff of silence, charged and fragile. The snow seemed to hold its breath. Rachel dared not blink. Finally, the bobcat huffed softly, almost like an exhale of surrender, and turned back into the trees. The kittens trailed after her, leaving a string of tiny prints in the snow that the wind began to erase. Rachel lowered the camera and realized her pulse was racing as though she had run miles. She knew the forest would swallow those paw prints soon enough, but she also knew she would not forget them. The encounter was more than chance. It felt like a visitation, a crossing of boundaries she never thought would bend. She sat on the porch long after the shadows faded, the cold seeping through her blanket. The photographs she'd captured trembled on her screen, but what lingered most was the echo of the bobcat's steady, waiting gaze. For the first time in years, Rachel's silence felt less like an empty prison and more like a doorway, cracked open. Something wild had stepped through, and now the question was whether she dared step forward to meet it. Days slipped by in the rhythm of snow and silence, yet Rachel's eyes no longer scanned the horizon only for cardinals and woodpeckers. Every creak of ice in the trees made her pulse quicken. Every shift of wind through the maples set her heart hoping. On the fifth morning, the bobcat returned. Not boldly, not close, but close enough that Rachel could see the gauntness in her flanks, the way the mother's ribs pressed against her fur. Hunger stalked her with every step. The kittens trailed behind, smaller than Rachel remembered, their ears twitching at every sound. Rachel's instinct warred against her reason. She knew the rules of the wild. Never interfere. Nature had its own order, its own law. Yet watching the weaker kitten stumble and collapse in the snow, she felt a pull so fierce it nearly drove her down the porch steps. Instead, she made a choice halfway between doing nothing and breaking every rule. She placed a small piece of salmon, left over from her own supper, on a flat rock near the edge of the clearing. Not close to the porch, not so far that the scent would be lost. She returned inside and waited, heart slamming against her ribs like a drum. At first the bobcat only circled, suspicion sharpening her every movement. She sniffed the air, ears angled back, eyes narrowing on the cabin. Minutes stretched. The kittens whined softly. Then, with a sudden dart, the mother lunged forward, snatched the fish, and vanished into the trees. Rachel's breath released in a rush she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. The next morning she tried again. This time venison scraps, left from a stew. Again the bobcat hesitated. Again she took the offering and slipped away. Slowly a rhythm began to form. Rachel never moved toward them. She never spoke. She left food, stepped back, and let silence carry her intentions. It became their language, a dialogue without words, a fragile pact written in distance and patience. Through her camera lens, Rachel studied them. The stronger kitten grew bolder, pouncing on snowflakes, its paws leaving chaotic trails. The frailer one, she began to call him Coda, often lagged, his legs uncertain, his breaths short. The stronger she named Luna, for the way her eyes glimmered in the moonlight one night, when Rachel caught them on camera. She hadn't named anything in years. Not since the graveyard stone carved with her daughter's name. To name meant to care. To care meant to risk loss. And yet, the names slipped from her lips before she could stop them, like prayers whispered into the empty cabin. Sometimes at night, she woke to the faintest sounds outside. Soft paws crunching on snow, a kitten's thin cry. She would lie in bed, holding her breath, listening to the nearness of life. It was enough to make the walls of her solitude tremble. Still, she told herself this was temporary. The wild could never truly belong to her, nor she to it. And yet, when she saw Coda stumble once more, weaker with each passing day, she wondered how long she could stay silent. The relationship had begun, not in words, not in touch, but in a quiet recognition that loneliness was no longer hers alone. Winter in Maine had a way of stripping everything down to its bones. The pines groaned under ice, streams froze mid-current, and even the sky seemed brittle with cold. Rachel knew this harsh rhythm well. She had lived within it for years, but watching the Bobcat family endure it was another matter. Through her telephoto lens, she began to notice changes. The mother, once fierce and steady, grew thinner by the week. Her steps slowed, shoulders hunched, as though the forest itself pressed against her spine. Each time she appeared at the clearing, Rachel saw less strength, more hunger. It was the kittens who revealed the truth most painfully. Luna bounded through the snow with bursts of wild energy, her body lean but resilient. Coda, however, faltered more with each visit. His paws sank deep, his legs trembling. More than once Rachel watched him collapse, his body a fragile shadow of his sister's vigor. One morning, as pale light spilled across the drifts, Rachel lifted her lens and froze. The mother bobcat dragged a scrawny rabbit through the snow. the kill barely larger than a crow. She dropped it at the kitten's feet, nudging them forward. Luna tore into it greedily. Coda managed a few weak bites before sinking back into the frost, exhausted. The mother didn't eat at all. Rachel lowered the camera, bile rising in her throat. She had known hunger in photographs, in stories, but here, in her clearing, hunger had a face. A face with amber eyes and ribs showing like fence slats. The ethical war inside her sharpened. Every conservation article she'd read repeated the same mantra. Do not interfere. To feed them was to change them, to risk their wildness, but to watch them starve. What law of nature justified that? That night, she scrolled through the photos on her laptop. The images blurred as her eyes filled. For the first time in years, memories of her daughter returned, not in dreams, but in sharp, waking color. The hospital bed, the machines, the helpless feeling of watching someone fade despite every prayer. And now, outside her cabin, another fragile life teetered in that same shadow. Unable to bear it alone, Rachel picked up her phone. She hesitated. Her contacts list was nearly empty, but finally dialed a number she hadn't used in months. The Wildlife Conservation Office. Her voice cracked as she explained what she'd seen. She asked about ethical ways to help without making the bobcats dependent on her. Could she leave food occasionally? Should she report the injured kitten? The specialist on the line listened carefully, then sighed. It's a hard line, ma'am. If you interfere too much, they may lose their ability to fend for themselves. But if the mother fails, nature will decide for them. Sometimes the best help is restraint. Restraint. The word echoed in Rachel's mind long after the call ended. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Restraint meant turning away. But when she thought of Coda's stumbling steps, she wasn't sure her heart could obey. The truth had settled heavy over her cabin like the snowdrifts outside. The forest was unforgiving, and not every creature would survive its grip. Rachel closed her eyes. The fire's warmth no match for the chill crawling through her chest. She whispered the names she had given them. Luna, Coda, as if naming them again could keep them alive. And deep down, she knew the harsh truth. Silence could no longer be her only language. The storm announced itself with a low groan across the horizon, like a warning from the mountains. Rachel had lived in Maine long enough to recognize the signs. The sudden drop in temperature, the sharp scent of snow in the wind, the eerie silence that fell just before the sky split open. By dusk, the world was swallowed whole. The blizzard slammed against her cabin with fists of ice, rattling the shutters, burying the porch in minutes. Trees bent and cracked beneath the weight of snow, their branches snapping like bones. Rachel fed the fire and braced herself, the loneliness of the storm pressing in. She thought of the bobcats out there, exposed, and her stomach knotted. The night dragged on in fragments of sleep and waking. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the walls, filling the air with a constant roar. She dreamed of Coda's faltering steps, Luna's bright eyes, the mother's gaunt ribs, all swallowed by a sea of white. When morning finally broke, the silence was deafening. Snowdrifts swallowed the pines, and the road to Bar Harbor had disappeared beneath a frozen ocean. Rachel bundled herself in layers, her boots crunching through waist-high snow as she shoved the cabin door open. What she saw on the porch stopped her heart. Curled against the wood, pressed together for warmth, lay the bobcat family. The mother's fur was caked with ice, her sides heaving. Luna trembled, paws tucked beneath her, and Coda, Rachel's breath caught. Coda lay limp, his hind leg twisted unnaturally, a dark stain of blood melting into the snow. The mother lifted her head, eyes locking on Rachel's. There was no snarl, no hiss, no attempt to flee. Instead, she rose shakily and nudged her broken kitten forward, placing him on the threshold of the human's door. Then she stepped back, her gaze steady but pleading. Rachel froze. The air between them pulsed with something raw, ancient, a wild creature entrusting its most fragile life to a woman who had nothing left but solitude. Coda whimpered, a weak, pitiful sound. His paw dragged across the porch boards, leaving streaks of red against the snowmelt. Rachel dropped to her knees, the cold biting through her jeans. Every instinct screamed at her. This is the moment. Do nothing, and he will die. Act, and you may change everything. Her hands shook as she reached for the kitten, leather gloves creaking. The mother bobcat tensed, her body taut as a bowstring, but she didn't attack. She only watched, her amber eyes blazing with something Rachel could only describe as trust. The storm had taken trees, roads, and power lines. But here, on her porch, it had delivered something else. A desperate plea, wrapped in fur and blood. Rachel gathered the frail body into a wool blanket, her breath hitching. Coda's warmth was fading fast. She turned once more to the mother, who stood in the snow, chest rising and falling, her eyes never leaving Rachel's face. The silence between them spoke louder than the storm itself. Rachel whispered, barely audible over her pounding heart. I'll try. And for the first time since her family's accident, she felt purpose ignite inside her chest. Sharp, terrifying, but alive. Rachel's pulse thundered as she cradled Coda against her chest, the kitten's body frighteningly limp beneath the wool blanket. The storm outside had eased, but its wreckage was everywhere. Snow piled like walls, roads buried, the forest twisted and broken. She thought of Dr. Harris in Bar Harbor, the old veterinarian who had once patched up her dog years ago. His voice came back to her now, from that phone call days earlier. If you save it, it may never return to the wild. Those words weighed heavy. But then Coda whimpered, a frail, stuttering cry that sliced through every barrier she had built around her heart. The decision wasn't theoretical anymore. It was bleeding on her porch. Rachel forced her shaking hands into action. She pulled on her thickest coat, leather gloves, and wrapped a scarf around her mouth. The air outside bit like knives. She swaddled the kitten tighter, tucking him inside her coat, feeling the faint flutter of his heartbeat against her ribs. The mother bobcat stood in the snow a few yards away, silent sentinel. Her breath rose in sharp clouds, her body taut, but she didn't move to stop Rachel. Their eyes met once more, an unspoken agreement. Rachel would take him. She would try. Her truck sat half buried under drifts, a white mound at the edge of the cabin. Rachel clawed at the snow with her gloved hands, clearing the windshield enough to see. The engine coughed, then roared reluctantly to life, exhaust curling into the frozen air. The drive to Bar Harbor was normally 20 minutes. Today, it felt like an eternity. The road was a narrow tunnel carved through endless white, the tires spinning on hidden ice. Trees bowed over the road, heavy with snow, some snapped clean across. Every mile tested her resolve. She gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles burned. Coda stirred faintly against her chest, a sound escaping that was barely a breath. Hold on, she whispered, voice cracking inside the truck's cab. Just a little longer. Halfway there, a fallen maple blocked the road. Rachel's stomach dropped. She slammed the truck into park, leaving the engine running for warmth, and stepped out into snow that swallowed her calves. She tugged at the branches, pushing with every ounce of strength, breath tearing her lungs. Finally, the trunk rolled just enough for her to edge the truck past. When she slid back into the driver's seat, her face burned raw, her fingers numb. She checked beneath her coat. Koda's eyes were closed, but his chest still moved, shallow but steady. Relief flooded her, brittle and fleeting. The truck skidded again as she turned into town. The familiar houses of Bar Harbor rose through the storm's wreckage, their roofs bent under snow. The Wildlife Rescue Center stood at the far end, its lights glowing faintly through the haze like a beacon. Rachel pulled into the lot, barely remembering to throw the truck into park before rushing out. The kitten pressed tight against her. Each step felt like a gamble, like the ground itself could betray her. At the door, she pounded with her free hand, her voice hoarse and urgent. "Please, help!" A figure appeared behind the frosted glass, unlocking the door with hurried hands. Warmth hit her face as she stumbled inside, clutching Koda like a lifeline. She had crossed the line, fully and completely. The wild was no longer out there. It was trembling in her arms, depending on her choice. And Rachel knew with a certainty that stole her breath. There was no turning back. Warmth hit Rachel like a tidal wave the moment she crossed the threshold. The air inside smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bright against her snow-blinded eyes. She staggered forward, clutching the fragile bundle tight to her chest. 2 staff members rushed to meet her, their hands already reaching. Rachel hesitated only a moment before peeling back the wool blanket to reveal the trembling Bobcat kitten. Gasps filled the entryway. "He's hypothermic," one of them muttered, lifting Koda with careful, practiced hands. And that leg, God. They whisked him into a side room, the doors swinging shut behind them with a hollow thud. Rachel was left standing alone, the blanket still clutched in her arms, the echo of that cry still ringing in her ears. Through a wide window pane, she saw them lay Koda on a steel table. Heat lamps flared on. Gloved hands moved with precision, checking his breathing, assessing the mangled hind leg, sliding a tiny mask over his muzzle to deliver oxygen. Rachel pressed her palm against the glass, as if sheer will could cross the barrier. The scene before her blurred, not because of the light, but because memory had slammed into her with brutal force. Years ago, she had stood in another sterile room, watching doctors fight for her daughter after the crash. She remembered the tubes, the beeping machines, the soft but urgent voices, and she remembered the helplessness, the way hope drained with every unanswered prayer. Her knees buckled. She sank into a chair, clutching the blanket as if it still carried Koda's warmth. The air felt too thin, her lungs too tight. She hadn't cried in years, but now the tears burned hot, sliding freely down her cheeks. Hours crawled. Staff passed by with sympathetic glances but no words. Rachel sat unmoving, her eyes fixed on the kitten's small body beneath the glow of the lamps. She whispered his name, Koda, as though saying it aloud tethered him to this world. At last, the door opened, and Dr. Harris himself stepped out, his white beard dusted with melting snow. He looked older than Rachel remembered, but his eyes were steady, kind. "He'll live," Harris said simply. Rachel blinked, stunned, as if the words were in another language. What? "He's malnourished, hypothermic, and that leg is broken. But he's strong in spirit. We'll set the bone, keep him warm, and give him time. He's young enough to heal. The relief crashed through her like a storm breaking, violent and unstoppable. Her face crumpled as sobs tore free, sobs she hadn't allowed since the funeral, since the nights she buried herself in silence rather than feel. Now, in this small rescue center, grief and hope collided, leaving her shaking, undone. Dr. Harris rested a hand on her shoulder. You did right by bringing him here. You gave him a chance. Rachel nodded, unable to speak. She pressed the blanket to her face, inhaling the faint trace of wild fur that lingered there. For the first time in years, the air filled her lungs without feeling like stone. Through the glass, she saw Coda stir faintly, his tiny chest rising and falling. Against all odds, he was still here. And so was she. The rescue center was quiet the following morning, save for the faint hum of heaters and the occasional rustle of animals housed in back rooms. Rachel hadn't slept. She dozed in a chair in the waiting area, her head jerking up every time footsteps passed by, every time she thought she heard Coda's cry. When Dr. Harris emerged, his expression was steady but somber. He made it through the night, he said. That alone is a victory. But now comes the harder part, deciding what his future looks like. Rachel followed him into a small conference room. Around the table sat 2 members of the local rescue board, their faces lined with both compassion and pragmatism. A stack of files lay in front of them, photographs of other rescues clipped neatly to the pages. Coda's leg will heal, but slowly, one of them explained. And more concerning is his growing familiarity with human scent. He's been handled, fed, and treated here. The more he associates people with survival, the less likely he'll thrive in the wild. The words cut deep. Rachel imagined Coda stumbling through the forest months from now, too weak to hunt, too trusting of the wrong things, a wild animal lost between 2 worlds. So you're saying he can't go back? She asked. The board members exchanged a glance. It's possible he could be placed in a sanctuary, somewhere with enclosures, care, permanent captivity. It's the safest option for animals that can't survive on their own. Sanctuary. The word felt both protective and suffocating. Rachel pictured Coda pacing behind fences, his spirit caged no matter how much room they gave him. He had already known the forest's silence, the sharp taste of winter wind. To confine him now felt like stealing more than his freedom. It felt like stealing his identity. Before she realized she was speaking, Rachel heard her own voice break the silence. What if I built something different? 3 sets of eyes turned to her. I live near Acadia. I have land. I could create a semi-wild enclosure. Logs, shrubs, space for him to climb and hunt small things. He wouldn't be caged in steel. He could grow with nature, not apart from it. I could be his guardian, but not his jailer. The room was quiet. Rachel's words hung in the air, reckless and tender. Dr. Harris studied her, his brow furrowed. You understand what you're offering, he said softly. This isn't just kindness. It's responsibility. Years of it. He'll never be a pet. He'll never be truly tame. He'll demand space, food, respect, and he'll tether you to him in ways you can't walk away from. Rachel swallowed hard. She thought of the empty cabin, the silent mornings, the photographs she took for no one but herself. She thought of the hollow ache that had lived in her chest for 6 years. And then she thought of Coda, small and fragile, his trust already woven with hers. I know, she whispered. But if he can't return to the wild, then at least let him stay close to it. I can give him that. And maybe it will give something back to me too. For a long moment, No one spoke. Then the board chair leaned back, exhaling. It's unconventional, but considering your land and your willingness, we'll allow it. On one condition: regular check-ins. If it ever becomes unsafe, for you or for him, we'll have to reconsider. Rachel nodded, tears pricking her eyes. Relief, fear, and hope all tangled inside her chest. As she left the center, the weight of her decision settled fully. She had crossed another threshold. Coda was no longer just a fragile life she had saved. He was now her charge, her companion, her second chance. Outside, the snow was beginning to thaw, dripping from the eaves in quiet rivulets. Rachel lifted her face to the pale sun, feeling warmth touch her skin for the first time in months. The choice had been made, and it was binding for both of them. The days that followed were filled with work Rachel hadn't done in years. Hard, physical labor that left her muscles aching, but her spirit strangely alive. She dragged pine logs across the snow, hammered wooden posts into the frozen ground, and stretched strong mesh between them to create an enclosure large enough for Coda to climb, hide, and breathe. She planted young shrubs and stacked branches into rough shelters, mimicking the cover of the forest. Neighbors might have thought she'd lost her mind if they had seen her. One woman, alone, building a sanctuary for a wild creature. But Rachel felt no shame. Each swing of the hammer, each log set in place, was a promise. A vow that the little Bobcat wouldn't spend his days behind cold steel bars. When at last Coda arrived from the rescue center, thin but stronger, his leg bound in a small brace, Rachel's heart clenched. He moved gingerly, ears flicking nervously as she released him into the space. For a moment, he froze, uncertain. Then his instincts stirred. He sniffed the air, leapt onto a fallen log, and let out a sharp, kittenish yowl. Rachel smiled through tears. He was no longer the fragile bundle she had carried through the storm. He was learning, once again, to be wild. Days turned into weeks. Coda grew stronger, testing his leg, chasing insects, leaping clumsily after sparrows that darted through the mesh. At night, Rachel sat on her porch, listening to his cries echo faintly through the trees. The sound filled the hollow places inside her, places she had thought were beyond repair. Then, one evening, as the moon rose pale over the pines, Rachel noticed movement beyond the fence line. She lifted her binoculars and froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the mother Bobcat, and beside her, wild and lean, was Luna. Rachel's breath caught. She hadn't seen them since the storm. Their coats gleamed under moonlight, their bodies strong, resilient survivors of the brutal winter. Coda must have sensed them too. From inside the enclosure, he let out a thin, wavering call. His ears pricked forward, his body pressed against the mesh. The mother Bobcat answered, a low, throaty chuff that carried across the clearing. Luna padded closer, her eyes locked on her brother. For a long moment, the night held its breath. Rachel stayed perfectly still, afraid even her heartbeat might shatter the fragile magic. She watched as Coda mewled softly, Luna responding with chirps of her own. The mother stood silent, her gaze steady, regal, filled with something Rachel could only call recognition. They did not touch. The fence remained between them, yet the air pulsed with connection. Calls exchanged, eyes meeting across distance, a reunion stitched together by sound and silence. Coda pressed his nose against the mesh, pawing lightly as if he could reach through. Luna crouched low, mirroring him. The mother gave one last rumbling call before turning back into the shadows, Luna following at her side. Coda remained at the fence long after they disappeared, his cries fading into quiet whimpers. Rachel's chest ached with both joy and sorrow. He had seen them. He had known he was not forgotten. But he had also felt the separation. Rachel whispered into the stillness, as much to herself as to him. Some bonds survive even walls. And for the first time she realized what she was building with Coda wasn't a replacement for what he had lost. It was a bridge, fragile and imperfect, but real. Spring came slowly to Maine, dripping from the eaves, softening the crust of snow, turning the woods into a patchwork of mud and green. In the enclosure Rachel had built, life stirred with the season. Coda, no longer the fragile scrap of fur she had first lifted from her porch, moved with growing strength. His leg, once broken, now bore his weight without falter. He leapt from logs to branches, his body leaner, his movements surer. Rachel watched him often from her porch, camera resting unused at her side. The images burned brightest not on screens or prints but in her memory. Coda clambering up a pine trunk, crouching low before pouncing on a grasshopper, curling in the shade with his chest rising steady. Every new skill was a quiet victory, a reminder that survival was no longer just a distant possibility. Yet Coda was not like Luna. Rachel knew it every time she saw the mother and her wild daughter pass silently through the trees beyond the enclosure. Sometimes days went by with no sign of them, but then, just when Rachel thought they had moved on, she would spot a ripple of spotted fur in the distance, a flash of amber eyes in the undergrowth. They never came close, never lingered long, but their presence was steady, an invisible thread tethering Coda to the life he had come from. On those nights, Coda would sit at the farthest edge of the fence, body pressed against the mesh, his ears twitching, his voice carrying across the clearing. The mother would respond with a single low chuff, Luna with bright chirps. Then they would melt back into the forest, leaving silence behind. Rachel felt the ache of that separation as deeply as Coda did. She knew he straddled two worlds, not wild enough to run free, not domestic enough to curl beside a fire. But rather than pity, she felt something else. Awe. For in that in-between space, he had forged a resilience of his own. And in truth, so had she. The walls of her cabin no longer felt like a tomb. They were alive with motion. The scrape of Coda's claws on bark, the rustle of his leaps, the occasional soft cry in the night. She found herself speaking aloud again, even if only to the empty room or to Coda across the yard. Her laughter, rusty at first, came easier when he tumbled clumsily after a squirrel he'd never catch. Sometimes she wondered if her husband and daughter would have smiled to see her now. Mud on her boots, sweat on her brow, heart cracked open once more. She could almost hear her daughter's voice teasing, "Mom, you've adopted a bobcat?" And for once, the thought didn't hurt. It warmed. Coda grew, the months shaping him into a young bobcat with sinew and grace. Yet whenever he pressed his nose to the mesh and met Rachel's gaze, there was no mistaking it. A bond had been carved, quiet but enduring. And when the mother bobcat appeared again one evening, standing calmly beyond the fence, Rachel felt a shiver. The animal didn't pace, didn't snarl, didn't retreat. She simply stood there, her gaze steady on Rachel. It wasn't fear, it wasn't threat, it was trust. For Rachel, that was enough. It had already changed her life. Spring loosened winter's grip one patient hour at a time. The snow retreated from the pines in ragged scallops, and the creek behind Rachel's cabin found its voice again. First a whisper beneath ice, then a quick, bright run over stones. On the porch step, a damp pattern of paw prints dried in the new sun. Codas, larger now and sure, padding to the fence at dawn to taste the wind. Beyond the mesh, softer tracings, wild, fleeting, hinted that the mother and Luna still ghosted through the trees whenever night grew kind. Rachel sat with her camera across her knees and opened the gallery that had become her second memory. There it all was, sequenced like breaths, the first grainy frame of a gaunt mother holding her ground. Luna's bright stare, Coda's wobbling stumble, the rabbit too small for three, the blizzard swallowing the world, a wool blanket wrapped around a life as fragile as a flame, heat lamps, steel table, trembling hope, an enclosure built log by log, moonlit eyes meeting across a fence. She'd taken thousands of photographs in her life, but these were the ones that seemed to look back at her. What surprised her most wasn't the drama in the images. It was their gentleness. The way wilderness, when it finally stepped close, didn't roar. It asked. It waited. It trusted. That thought had changed the shape of her mornings. She still lifted the lens, but more often she lowered it and simply watched, letting the moment breathe without being pinned to pixels. Word of the Bobcat story traveled farther than Rachel expected. A ranger at Acadia asked to display a small series of prints at the visitor center. A librarian in Blue Hill invited her for a talk on compassion and boundaries in wildlife encounters. A high school science teacher from Ellsworth brought students out to the edge of her yard to sketch tracks and talk ethics. How do you help without harming? Where is the line between stewardship and control? Rachel didn't pretend to hold perfect answers. She told them what happened, where she hesitated, and how often the right thing felt like standing in deep snow between two difficult paths. Coda grew into a quiet constant. He was never tame, never sought touch, never asked for more than space and the dignity of watching the forest do what it does. In the evenings, he'd rest on the high log, eyes half closed, listening, always listening, to the distant conversations of his kind. Sometimes the mother's low chuff drifted back, sometimes Luna's bright chirp, sometimes only wind. On those nights, Rachel set a camp chair near the fence and read aloud from a field guide, or sat with her hands open on her knees, not as an owner, not as a savior, but as a neighbor learning a new language. Grief had not left her life. It had learned to share the room. Where pain once made everything small and airless, it now rode alongside other things. The surprised smile of a kid who spotted bobcat tracks before anyone else. The way sunlight turned Coda's whiskers into silver threads. The ordinary miracle of hot coffee, birdsong, and a day that asked nothing but attention. She realized, slowly and then all at once, that the wild had not filled the emptiness by crowding it. It had stretched the walls and let light in. When people asked what the story meant, at the visitor center, at the library, in the grocery line in Bar Harbor, Rachel found herself returning to one simple sentence. To me, this is not just the story of a bobcat that survived. It's proof that unconditional trust still exists in the wild. She saw heads nod, eyes soften. A few people wiped at their cheeks, surprised by how much it moved them to imagine a mother cat laying her broken child on a human porch and stepping back. If you're hearing this now, she would add, I'd love to know where you're listening from. The world is wide, but trust is small and stubborn. It shows up in kitchens and classrooms and cabins at the tree line. Have you ever been offered trust you didn't feel ready to carry? Did you take it anyway? Tell us. Those stories teach the rest of us how to stand in the snow and say yes. On the first true warm morning, Rachel brewed coffee and stood at the porch rail while mist lifted off the creek. She flipped once more through the photos, the shaky beginnings, the blizzard's white fury, the quiet reunions stitched by moonlight. And then she set the camera down and watched Coda lift his head to the dawn. He didn't look back at her. He looked out. That felt right. There would be more choices, more lines to walk carefully. Fences rust. Forests change. Trust must be tended like a small fire. But for now, spring held. The prints in the mud were fresh. Somewhere beyond the spruce, a mother and a wild daughter moved with the confidence of survivors. And here, within the space Rachel made, a once broken kitten breathed steadily into whatever came next. If this story touched something in you, share your own moment of trust, animal or human, in the comments so others can learn from it. And if you want more true stories of courage, heartbreak, and hope, subscribe and stay with us. There's room on this porch for you too.